I think the conflict will finish, but the effect of this conflict will not finish after 5, I don't know, maybe 15 years. After 15 years, maybe more than. So the conflict will finish, but the bad effect will not finish. And this period will affect on not only one person, affect on a generation. I don't know, most of people and all people now in Syria have problem, has a psychological problem. I think all people in Syria now need a therapy. All of them, the children, the men, the women, all of them, yeah. Also, my plan to make is just like to work in education sector in Syria, because I believe the education it's one of the best thing will change. So if I change the education in Syria, maybe I can change a lot.
هلا اللي صار كان في جمعنا جماعة من الغوطة، يعني من الغوطة شاب مصلح، هو بيصلح، فعلى الشغل كان هو مستأجر محل صغير مواجهه محلي، فكان يضطر ينزل على حفير يجيب قطع، فعرض علي المشروع واحنا قاعدين عم نشرب شاي، يعني الدنيا باردة مشغلين النار وقاعدين قدام المحل السمانة. قال لي إذا معك مصاري لا نشتغل هيك. عرضت أنا الفكرة إنه أنا ما بفهم فيها يعني، فقنعني مرتين ثلاثة. حكيت مع جوزي قلت له والله في هيك مشروع. كانت أكثر العالم مشهورة دوما بالتصليح الدراجات النارية يعني، فلما صارت الأحداث سكرت دوما، ما ضل في مكان وما كان في غيري يعني بالمخيم، فبلشت يعني أول فاتورة جبناها ب10,000.
قد ما حاولنا نطلع في شيء بيوقفنا، بيقيدنا بهي الفترة اللي مرقنا فيها. يمكن أنا ما كان عندي أذى جسدي مثل بالنسبة للحالات اللي كانت هي حوالينا. كان بالنسبة لي كان الأذى النفسي هو الصعب، الأذى النفسي هو القاسي. تأذيت نفسيا أكثر بكثير مراحل، بكثير ظروف انضغطت فيها، بكثير ظروف ومواقف مرقت معي هي كانت سيئة علي بحياتي، هي تأثرت فيها كثير. حاولت اتجاوزها بس بضل له اثر، بضل في جرح له لهذا الاذى النفسي، بضل له اثر جواتنا كبير، رح يضل مرافقنا. ما في بالمشاعر في شيء ما بينمحى. جسديا ما تأذيت قد ما تأذيت نفسيا، قد ما كان هذا الشيء صعب، قد ما كان هذا الشيء قاسي نفسيا علينا. ظروف جبرتني لانه تغير حياتي اني اكون مصر لادور على الاحسن بهي الظروف السيئه. خلتني انتقل لشوف واقع قاسي بس كثير حلو.
I want to welcome everyone to this Zoom event. I'm Michelle Lesh and I'll be moderating our discussion today. We're talking on Zoom from different places around the world, so I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where I'm located in Melbourne, Victoria, the Bunwurrung people who are part of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. For those of you who have just joined us, and for those of you who watched this introductory video, we decided to start this event by sharing some testimonies from the Syrian conflict. And we recently marked the 10th anniversary since the beginning of this conflict, making our discussion today on protracted conflict timely and important. And the ICRC interviewed 1,400 young Syrians, and through their personal stories, we gain insight into the deep and diverse effects of protracted conflict on a population. In particular, we saw them speaking about the psychological trauma, about displacement, and about family tragedy. And for those of you interested, the ICRC Library has also published a special issue of the IHL bibliography covering 10 years of scholarship on that conflict. Accountability for IHL violations is a focus, and other issues covered include foreign fighters, chemical weapons, and also cultural heritage. But in our discussion today, we're going to reflect on the themes related to protracted conflict more generally, as the number and length of conflicts around the world continues to increase. And this is going to be done in the context of us launching the International Review of the Red Cross edition that focuses on this topic. And it's the third joint Australian Red Cross and ICRC event in a series that launches upcoming editions of the review, which has proven to be a wonderful collaboration, celebrating the work of the review, which is an extremely important resource for anyone interested in international law and international relations. And each edition tends to provoke conversation, debate, and reflection on relevant and significant topics. I'm moderating this discussion in my capacity as an academic member of the Victorian IHL Australian Red Cross Committee. The Australian Red Cross, through the important work of the IHL program, has IHL committees around the country. And a large focus of the committee's work is to disseminate IHL to the Australian public and promote respect for IHL. And this event has been organised by the Victorian IHL Committee in partnership with the Australian mission of the ICRC in Canberra. I'd like to thank Emily Defina in particular, who has in many ways made this event possible and has been a pleasure to work with. Now, to avoid protracting this introduction even further, I'd like to now introduce the panelists and speakers who, as you will see, their diverse and rich experience and expertise will no doubt provide us with a fascinating discussion on the topic of protracted conflict. Ellen Polizzinski is a legal advisor at the ICRC. She worked on the editorial team of the International Review of the Red Cross from 2014 to 2020 and was editor-in-chief in interim at the time of this edition of Protracted Conflict was being produced. She's currently a member of the project team charged with updating the commentaries of the 1949 Geneva Conventions and their 1977 additional protocols. Hichem Kavraoui is the Director of Operations of Geneva Call, a humanitarian organisation promoting better respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law to armed non-state actors in conflict settings. Before joining Geneva Call, he worked at the ICRC, both at field and headquarters levels in various senior management and program coordination positions in countries including Somalia, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Dr. Sebastian Shadow is a former senior advisor to the Attorney General of the Republic of Colombia, where he worked on the application of international humanitarian law by domestic courts and supervised all investigations and prosecutions of war criminals and breaches of the laws of war. He was also appointed as a legal advisor to the governmental delegation negotiating a peace agreement with the different armed groups involved in Colombia's protracted armed conflict. And lastly, we have Philippe Schmitzkinot, who is a policy advisor in the RCRC's Policy and Humanitarian Diplomacy Division. She guides the institution's policy reflection and external engagement on issues related to the long-term consequences of conflict and violence, including questions of missing persons, protracted conflict, and the links between humanitarian action, development, and peace efforts. Prior to joining the RCRC, she worked in protection-related advocacy, project management, and advisory roles with international NGO coalitions, including prolonged assignments in Afghanistan and Sudan. Ellen will now begin with some introductory remarks about the review and the Protracted Conflict edition. We're then going to turn to a discussion with the three panelists, and we will leave time at the end for your questions. So please type them into the chat box function during the duration of the event, and we'll do our best to get to them at the end. This event is being recorded, and we suggest that you view it through speaker view to be able to see each speaker talking that will dominate your screen. Please keep yourselves on mute for the duration of the event, and thank you again for joining us. I'll now hand over to Ellen.
Thanks, Michelle. I hope I'm unmuted now. I think it did. Thanks to you and to all the organizers from the Australian Red Cross and to Emily and my colleagues from ICRC Canberra. I enjoyed working on this edition as an editor, and I'm very happy to be here to introduce it with a few words to give a little bit of background behind the reflection surrounding the edition and a taste of what's covered in it. As many of you might be aware, the International Review of the Red Cross is over 150 years old. It was first published in 1869, and it's the oldest international publication dedicated to humanitarian law and action. So each topic addressed by a thematic issue of the journal is selected by the editorial board to inform ongoing humanitarian debates. And given the length of time that it takes to produce an edition of the journal, which can be over a year, sometimes two, when the editorial board chooses a topic, what we need to do is really project out into the future to try and predict what will be relevant in the time it takes to produce and publish the edition. Unfortunately, when we were considering the topic of protracted conflict, we had no worry that it would still be of concern in the time it took to publish the edition. The question was more how to capture the many challenges that are posed by conflicts that last for not only years, but decades, and even in some cases, generations. So what we thought about was how these what are sometimes called long wars can last for such a long time that they're often normalized and almost forgotten about by the international community. And we thought for that reason, it was particularly important to dedicate an edition to this topic. And we wanted to draw attention to especially the human cost of protracted conflict as a phenomenon, some of the trends that can be seen in these types of conflicts, the legal considerations surrounding them, and highlight a few of the efforts that are in place to address these challenges. But the first challenge we face really as editors is that there's no one definition of protracted conflict. This is a phenomenon that has many faces, and it's sometimes described as simmering or frozen conflicts, episodic or cyclical. It covers a range of different situations, such as the prolonged occupation, persistent border disputes, or protracted insurgencies, among other types of conflict. And so really, given the varied typology that we were looking at, it was hard to narrow down what we're talking about concretely, even though it's something that, you know it when you see it, so to speak. So in the absence of a legal definition, we looked to international relations and to a scholar called Edward Azar, who is an international relations expert who in the 1970s coined the term protracted conflict. And in his conceptualization, these types of conflicts are characterized by their longevity, their intractability, and their mutability. And so we used his definition to frame what should be included in this edition. Another consideration early on in the process was how to keep the people most affected by protracted conflict at the center of this conversation. And to that end, this edition opens with the stories of two women who are living in context of protracted conflict, who spoke to our colleagues and told them their stories. They're presented in the form of timelines. And you can see from these timelines how these women sort of measure the passage of time by events, by a marriage or the birth of a child, but also the beginning of a siege or the destruction of a home, the death of a family member, or the number of times that they've had to flee. And in featuring this testimony right away in the edition, we wanted to emphasize that this is far from an academic discussion, although it can at times be quite technical. So with that grounding, another aspect we wanted to show were some of the more systemic humanitarian consequences of these types of conflicts for affected populations as a whole. So this includes the cumulative effects of hostilities on infrastructure and also prolonged displacement, just to name two of the challenges that are covered in articles in this edition. There's a humanitarian imperative to respond to these challenges, and many organizations have been responding for decades. Strikingly, the average length of time that the ICRC has been present in its 10 largest occupations is now approximately 42 years, which may not fit the image that many people have of humanitarian relief as a sort of emergency response that's short-lived. But the duration of the humanitarian operations in these settings is now quite long-term. And this has caused organizations like the ICRC to rethink our way of working and to reflect on how we interact with development actors. On the flip side of that coin, it's also caused development actors to think about how they interact with humanitarian organizations. And some of those points of view are also reflected in this edition. Some legal scholars and practitioners question how international law, and in particular international humanitarian law, applies or even how it's applicable in these types of conflicts. They look at how we decide when an armed conflict has ended for the purposes of IHL applicability, and also whether in such prolonged situations there should be a broader role for human rights law. So I know we have two of our authors with us today, and it's always very dangerous to tell experts about what they themselves have written. So I'll let them speak to their specific contributions. But I wanted to just give a brief overview of some of the many things that are covered. As an editor, every time I produced an edition of the review, I was really hoping that it would open rather than close the discussion. And to that end, I'm really happy that we're here today with these panelists to continue this conversation. And I hope that it inspires you not only to read the edition, but also to take this reflection back with you and incorporate it into your own work. Before I hand back over to Michelle, I want to mention some of the other upcoming editions of the review on behalf of my colleagues on the editorial team currently. And they asked me to highlight the edition on digital technologies and war, which has also recently come out, and to flag that there are two upcoming editions in the coming months that will be published, one on the Sahel and one on counterterrorism and sanctions, which will look specifically at how these measures affect humanitarian actors. So to keep up with the latest and greatest news from the review, I'd encourage you to sign up for the ICRC Law and Policy newsletter, and I'll include the link in the chat so that you can continue to get that news. But now, after that spiel, I'll hand back over to Michelle to get our panel started and to continue this important discussion on protracted conflict.
Thank you, Ellen, for that excellent overview of this edition of the review and the complex nature of this topic, which you so successfully cover with a diverse range of pieces by different kinds of experts and practitioners. And as you said, we're lucky enough to have two of the contributors today with us. So I just want to start with the discussion with our panelists by asking them all to briefly describe for us some of the conflict situations that they've actually experienced firsthand through their professional work, because as you'll see, they've all had very interesting and diverse experiences, and also to ask them about what struck them most in terms of the challenges faced by populations around the world enduring protracted conflict. This is just as a way to give us an introduction and some context about the specifics in relation to the concept of protracted conflict. So Hisham, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. I hope that everyone can hear me. So thanks first of all for the invitation. I'm very honored to be part of this discussion today. I have some, let's say, examples or situations that I faced personally when I was in the field, especially in situations where conflicts are protracted. I will take one example, or let's say two examples, if I have like 2 minutes to describe them, that for me are pretty striking. The first one is Libya, but as well Yemen. Libya, Yemen, and Syria. Why I take these examples? Because I had the opportunity to visit these countries at different periods of times during the conflict that is still going on in those countries. For Libya, this is where I was with the ICRC as the deputy head of delegation. We were opening the operations in mid-2011. So when Tripoli fell and we had all these fightings. So I saw and I was there on the ground with populations that basically were struck by conflict, populations that did not experience any type of conflict before. Libya was a type of country that is comparable to what we see in the Western world. Let's say that they had their life in the social and economic type of course, I will not talk about the politics. And suddenly you had this massive war that happened from all over the place, from armed groups, from regular armies, from coalitions, and the destruction of infrastructures, closing of schools, and displacement, and so on and so on. So I saw this first snapshot, and I saw a population that was basically struck and didn't really know even how to handle it. And I just give one example where we wanted to distribute some assistance with the teams in one school that was occupied by displaced people. They were really freshly displaced, people with high income and educated. And when we came with my colleagues with blankets, I remember there were some nappies for babies and baby milk. They did not want it at the beginning because they say that we don't need that, give it to poor people or conflict countries that I used to have in mind. So this was, for me, was really striking because I saw that they were not really, they didn't put into their mind that actually this conflict will have massive impact today and then in the future. And then I just jump in time for Libya. I came back to Libya in 2019, so it was 2 years ago. So 8 years after the first time of the conflict. And here I saw populations that actually endured and experienced protracted conflict. And they were used to violence, they were used, unfortunately, to violations. And I saw some population, some people, some communities that were more cynical. They were more basically at ease with navigating around dangers, around armed groups, around militias, changing commands. And I saw some as well, some risky as well, let's say, habits. Kids crossing areas that are heavily mined or with shootings because for them it was a new terrain to play football, for example. This is one I saw in one of the areas close to Benghazi. So this for me was very striking. And same situation happened in Yemen when I was in Yemen in 2015. as well at the beginning of the conflict. I think it becomes a pattern for me. So it was, I think, in May 15, and Sana'a was heavily bombed, and in other countries we had a lot of fighting. So it was the beginning of this war. And I came back last February, basically 2 months ago, to Yemen for Geneva call, where I talked to the armed groups, I talked to the communities, and I saw community members that increase their resilience, increase, let's say, their capacities to adapt. But as well, I saw communities that basically a bit lost hope in the fact that that armed actors could basically fight differently and have a better behavior, because they just saw this dragging on and on and on. And we see, of course, situations where you have youngsters that take up arms because this is an economic opportunity for them. So they become the fighters, losing a little bit the political or what they believe in, and rather who is paying a bit more. And it's something that I saw as well in Syria, and I will finish by that, where I was in Syria in 2014, yes, in many cities with the ICRC, same thing, conflict was just starting. And when I came back last year and the year before, I saw the same situation. And what struck me is really the young generations that are really adapted, unfortunately, too well to the new reality, and they basically value much more guns and power than education, and for them is a matter of survival. And I think this is something where I want to finish this introduction, is that one of the bigger risks of these protracted conflicts, if you of course don't talk about infrastructures and health services, is really about the young generation, because it can be a ticking bomb. So I stop here, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Hisham, for sharing those insights with us. And we see that there are these similarities between the different conflicts, and also these kind of distinctiveness for the different conflicts and the way they tragically affect the population in different ways. I'll turn to you now, Philippa, if you could share some of your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Michelle, and good afternoon, evening, morning to everyone. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. So, I mean, there are many things that have struck me in the experience of populations affected by protracted conflicts, but there are two things which perhaps have struck me the most. And the first is how conflict and the humanitarian response really shape entire lifetimes and even generations in a community. We heard some of these testimonies in the video earlier that really speak to that long-term effect. But what the image that I had in mind was in South Sudan, for instance, not too long ago. I spent some time in Blue Nile State with a community which had recently been displaced, and who was organizing a makeshift school for the children of the village. And the teachers there were the few adults in that community who had received basic education decades earlier, as they were themselves displaced children living in a refugee camp in Ethiopia. And it made me wonder, had the organizations working in that refugee camp decades ago known in what situation those children would be 20 or 30 years down the line, would they have designed their education support differently? Would they have forged different partnerships? Could that intergenerational dividend that we could see there in that village, could it have been bigger? And the second thing that has struck me in protracted conflicts is how risk easily becomes part of people's everyday lives. And here I'm thinking of, for instance, children living along frozen conflict lines, frozen front lines in Azerbaijan, Armenia, but also places like Ukraine, who go to schools that are equipped with shelters, sandbags, anti-blast film on windows. And what strikes me in these situations is that while risk management measures are extremely important, because life does resume to some form of normality when fighting becomes sporadic, these measures also somehow normalize the threat. And to me, it's important to avoid this pitfall of letting the onus of protection slowly but surely shift entirely to populations. So it's important to maintain a dialogue on political levels with political actors, with parties to conflict, to make sure that they protect civilians and that the risk ceases to exist altogether. And to me, this is a responsibility that's much broader than humanitarian action.
Thanks so much, Philippa. That's a really powerful point that you make about the normalization of risk. I want to turn now to Sebastian to give us a bit of insight into Colombia and the conflicts, I should say, rather than conflict, that has endured in that country.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for the invitation. I'm humbled by being in with such learned colleagues. The Colombian conflict, you could make the case, I suppose, as the article in this edition of the review does, that we've been immersed in some sort of conflict since the foundation of our country, so over 200 years. Doctrinally speaking, I suppose as an attempt to give it some technical limitations, we say that the conflict started in the 1960s, when there was a proper definition of the different parties that were being hostile to each other, and has extended so far. So we say that the ongoing Colombian armed conflict has been ongoing for about 60 years, which would make it, at the very least, the longest ongoing conflict in the world, I think. So what Hisham and what Philippa say was something very much that was the premise of working in that environment. Hostilities and war have been normalized. It wasn't something that could happen, but that has happened institutionally and judicially in Colombia for many decades now. The ICRC considers that Colombia, that there are currently 5 ongoing armed conflicts in Colombia, 4 between the state and different organized armed groups, and 1 between 2 specific of these organized armed groups. This is in no way to be critical of the ICRC and its classification, because it is very helpful for us public servants when trying to give IHL some sort of, to operationalize IHL in the domestic jurisdiction. These things are very helpful, but as you would know, all of you would know too well, to speak with our colleagues of the ICRC in Colombia, it's a little bit strange to analytically divide 5 ongoing conflicts between different parties and themselves, and maybe later I'll explain how that's a big challenge for actual prosecution, where you are expecting a prosecutor to be able to tie a criminal act with a specific conflict, and where then they are expected to be able to create these analytical links between specific actions and specific parties, conflicts that can give it some weight. Honestly, in my experience, my experience with these groups has been either from the institutional side, helping the Attorney General's office devise the ways by which to investigate and prosecute any international crime committed in Colombia, and was later to participate in the peace negotiations with 2 of these groups. One of them, the very large one, which you all might know, which was FARC, with which the Colombian government signed a peace agreement in 2016 and then 2017 again. And which is now formally dissolved, and its remaining people come from one of those organized armed groups with which the Colombian state is currently engaging in an armed conflict. And I was also part of the negotiation with a group which still hasn't signed any sort of ceasefire agreement with the Colombian government, which is the National Liberation Army. So I actually had the experience of undertaking 2 different peace negotiations for 2 different armed conflicts in the same territory, which was, obviously difficult, but eccentric to say the least, in that it demanded, especially for us lawyers, a little bit less abstraction in that the complexities of a protracted conflict with different parties, which you are then sitting and negotiating in different places, naturally at some points require some sort of generalization. My experience with the Colombian conflict with the different parties and traveling around the world to discuss ceasefire negotiations with other countries and their experiences while we were doing it the same. Honestly, what surprised me is how similar they are. How, of course there are nuances, textures to all of them, but it seemed to me like the big issues, really, the big challenges related to protracted conflicts where I could see them in Myanmar, in Afghanistan, in Ireland, in South Africa. They were very common. So I often liked to say that where some conflicts have religion, some conflicts have ethnicity, our conflict had class, which is a very odd and sort of old school reason to go to war, because our groups are Marxist groups that wanted to overthrow the government by force to install a communist government, which seems a little bit quaint to speak a bit of that nowadays. But then I guess what I'm trying to say by this is that I did detect some sort of cultural uniqueness, and that the class thing in our culture plays the role that ethnicity might play for different Burmese actors in the Burmese conflict. But at the end, the challenge is how to handle large caseloads, how to break the violent link of people that have been born, raised, and died in situation of armed conflict. What that does to the sort of criminality that a particular country engages with. All of that was pretty similar. So there was a good sort of amount of good practices and experience to discuss about what to do with protracted armed conflicts. I'll stop there and maybe.
Yeah, we'll pick that up again a bit in the next question. But thank you for kind of elucidating for us some of the complexities of the Colombian conflict. I want to now turn to focus on the varied consequences of protracted conflict by looking at some of the pieces in this edition of the review, including some of them by the panelists. So I'll start with Hichem. Hichem, in your piece in this edition of the review, you discuss the challenges involved in what you call the fragmented nature of armed non-state actors in protracted conflict because of what you say is the short lifespan of armed groups, which tend to split, mutate, or join larger groups. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us a bit about how do you address the humanitarian challenges presented by the fragmentation of these groups, and has it in fact led to a decline in respect of IHL by them?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. I mean, it is true that it's not a new phenomenon. I think it's important to say that it's not like just a few years ago armed group decided let's fragment. It's something that of course has been going on for now several years. I think it's really linked to the nature of the conflicts that are much more complex. I mean, you have layers of conflicts within one conflict with let's say external actors being involved and then stopping the involvement, other actors joining. So this is why we see a bit. I mean, it's basically mirrors. I mean, armed groups mirror the international situation. I mean, the state situation. So I think this is important. It is true that the armed groups, and we saw in the recent examples of the Syrian conflict, I think at some point we had around 1,300 armed groups. So really, no one knew exactly who was whom. Armed groups could be formed. I remember that Geneva call, we engaged with a group called El Hazem Brigade, and then suddenly it completely disappeared. It has been swallowed up by another armed groups. There's a matter of survival. I think, first of all, it's all about behind their economic capacity to sustain themselves, because they have to pay soldiers, to pay weapons, and all the other costs. It's like business, basically. They become basically small businessmen. So this is why they, the splitting, the mutation, the joining coalitions. Of course, you will have some that will say is for, of course, for some political reasons. They have dividing views. But at the end of the day, I mean, for the majority, is really about survival. Let's not as well forget the very much important factor of state involvement. States really could influence as well the let's say the existence or affect the existence of an armed group. They can even force them to join other armed groups because they have bigger political interest. And we saw in countries like Syria or like Libya, an armed group that basically was, I mean, just changed completely their objective. Initially, it was fighting against the regime or any other, let's say, opponent, and then they changed their agenda because now they basically got under the leadership of a state that has, of course, other interests. So I think, and this is not something that I talked in my article, but we should at some point as well maybe discuss in the future about this intricate relationship between states, let's say sponsor states and other type of states and the armed groups. The challenges that are caused by this situation on the ground is, first of all, we don't really know with whom to talk to. Because at some day one, we talk to this leader, and in day two, you learn that this leader is no more a leader, but there's another one that is really not really accessible. So I think this is something very much difficult for many humanitarian organizations, that especially for those that don't have the, let's say, the skills or the habits to deal with armed groups, to analyze them, to map them, to follow them. I mean, most of the organizations are charities, they are local actors, or even international. They do relief. We don't have, not everyone is like ICRC or Geneva Call or NRC, the ones with experience. Most of them don't have experience with armed groups. So it's very, very hard. And it affects, of course, provision of assistance, relief, and even the security of the staff. So I think this is something that is really much a factor. And then the other challenge that we see is that because the groups change allegiance, adhere to a new, let's say, mentality or new vision, they may change their behavior as well, or the way they were acting. Because before they were maybe more respecting, IHL, or respecting the, let's say, the displaced communities from a particular ethnic group. And because they changed to another group which has more radical views, they had to change as well their own behavior themselves. If not, they basically don't exist anymore. And this, of course, has consequence on the populations. So it leads, of course, to a decline in respect for IHL. I mean, this is for me in general. I mean, if you basically I use and Geneva Call, we were used to engage with a particular armed group on a strategic manner for many years. We review their policies, and suddenly they split or they join another coalition. Then, of course, you lose what you told, what you discussed with. So I think this is something that, of course, there is a decline in the respect for IHL. I will just finish by giving one line on how we could address the challenges that I just explained. I think is about having the internal capacities as well inside the organization of understanding quickly this changing nature at conflict level, at field level, and being able, of course, to adapt the way we work, so we avoid, of course, having security incidents to our staff. I stop here.
Thank you, Hisham, for kind of giving us a bit of an insight into the important and very difficult and delicate work of Geneva Call in dealing with the complexities of armed non-state actors. I want to now turn to Philippa. In your piece, your Q&A, you tease out the relationship and tensions between humanitarian development, peace efforts in protracted conflict. It's what you dub the triple nexus. And I was wondering whether you can explain the ICRC's approach to these distinct and overlapping efforts, which aims to help create sustainable humanitarian impact for the affected population. And maybe I'll couple that with one of the questions that links to it from the audience, from Nadeshda, who asks that in the absence of conflict means, she says the absence of conflict means peace, but is there much discussion around what peace looks like when parties to the conflict try to reach an agreement?
Thank you, Michelle. So the humanitarian development and peace efforts coexist in protracted conflicts. They involve a variety of actors, local and foreign, who operate in different ways, but who all form a pool of knowledge, expertise, capacity to influence, and resources that can help improve the situation of affected people. So this triple nexus is not a term that I invented. It's a term that's used now in policy discussions, and there have been many other iterations of this same reality of how these different types of responses to the problem of armed conflict can be complementary and better come together. So it is a very old discussion. On your question of how the ICRC approaches this, so for us as a humanitarian organization, we approach development and peace actors in a very pragmatic way. We see that people in protracted conflicts are dealing with not only emergencies, but also large-scale systemic challenges affecting livelihoods, essential services, systems, institutions, forms of governance. We know that these are challenges that have deep roots and multiple dimensions. They come from social, economic, commercial, political, climatic, environmental factors. All of these factors intersect to exacerbate humanitarian needs. And we recognize that people's needs also evolve over time, and that an emergency short-term relief is not necessarily a relevant or sustainable form of support. And the point made by Hisham in his opening remarks about this family in Libya who didn't feel they need and the assistance package with the nappies and the non-food items really struck me. Speaking to this point, it's how do we manage as humanitarian actors to rethink the way we operate so that we can support people before they exhaust their coping mechanisms, before they become destitute. I think a lot of these evolutions of needs in protracted conflicts also challenge us to think about the timing of our support and also the nature of that support. How can it be best tailored to the particular situation of families and affected communities? So the question really is how do we need to engage with actors that are involved in peace and development efforts that are outside our traditional humanitarian sphere in order to better support affected people? That's the pragmatic question. And there are many ways, and I would maybe cluster them around 3 key avenues. One is around knowledge exchange. The second one is around advisory role and mobilization, what we call mobilization in the ICRC. And the third one is around partnerships and operational collaboration. So first, we engage in knowledge exchange and knowledge development with some of those actors to improve our own action. bringing methodologies that are from other sectors that improve the way we work in these settings, and we also bring our expertise to improve the action of others. And a great example of this is a recent collaboration between the World Bank, UNICEF, and the ICRC around the resilience of water and sanitation providers in protracted conflicts based on the experience of all three organizations in the Middle East and North Africa region. The report was launched just a few weeks ago, and it's very interesting because it contains recommendations on crisis and, most importantly, pre-crisis measures that need to be put in place and to strengthen the resilience of those systems in the future should a crisis hit again. The second avenue of engagement, what I sort of framed as advisory role and mobilization, is when we engage with actors outside our traditional humanitarian sphere around an issue of humanitarian concern, to bring them around that issue, because it's an issue that requires large scale action, or that requires action at a political or policy level. In the Q&A in the international review, I give the example of our engagement with the trilateral contact group in Ukraine around the protection of water infrastructure. So, an engagement with a very political forum around a humanitarian issue. But there are many other examples. For instance, our engagement with prison and judicial authorities around improvement of conditions of detention through systemic approaches. The work that we do very often in collaboration with National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies to advocate for services, policies, and legal frameworks to address the humanitarian needs of particular categories of the population that may not receive attention because of in a conflict area, in particular when states and governments are cash-strapped. So I'm thinking of categories of population like the war wounded, persons with disabilities, families of missing persons, displaced persons, etc. And then the third avenue of engagement is around this partnerships and operational collaboration. And so these are situations where we engage with actors outside a traditional humanitarian sphere on specific initiatives that have humanitarian relevance, but also broader relevance. One example is our role as a neutral intermediary in the release, for example, of detainees relatively recently in Yemen. The release itself was brokered through political actors and political talks led by others, but the implementation required a neutral intermediary that we were placed to play that role. And the outcome had a humanitarian relevance, obviously, because it enabled detainees to be reunited with their families. Another example, completely different, is operational collaborations that we have been setting up with development donors in places like South Sudan, Iraq, or Gaza. And this is really looking at ways to finance multi-year projects which are critical for restoring and safeguarding essential services that are direly needed by the populations now, and that can also avert public health risks, and for which we have an added value because of our access, because of our knowledge of the state of the systems and how they have been disrupted by the recent conflict. So this is another example of these operational collaborations. But this leads me to a final point, which is that our engagement with actors involved in development or peace efforts is grounded on our added value as a neutral, impartial, and independent actor. That is what enables us to have access to areas where others can't go. That's what enables us to be a trusted intermediary where it's needed. And so certain partnerships can require specific measures to safeguard our ability to operate according to those principles, but we're also seeing more and more that many actors involved in development and peace efforts have come to understand humanitarian principles as an added value to be cherished and maintained, and not as a restriction or a barrier to collaboration. And this is an emerging mindset shift, but an important one, and it's happening both on the side of development and peace actors, and on the side of humanitarian actors, including the ICRC. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Philippa, and thanks for ending on that very inspiring and hopeful note. It's great to hear. I know we're kind of tight for time, and there are a few questions from the audience that I do want to get to. I just want to kind of round off this discussion about the varied consequences of protracted conflict by turning now to Sebastian, who, as he's explained to us, has insight into the relationship between IHL and domestic law when war becomes normalized in a country. And in this edition of the review, there is an article by Munoz and Saralvo, and they discuss Colombia and the fact their position is that it's contributed to the development of IHL norms as a consequence of ongoing armed conflict and peace agreements. So I just wanted to know from you, Sebastian, whether you agree with this based on your experience, and whether you can briefly discuss for us the rich volume of jurisprudence related to the conduct of war and how it can change the way domestic judicial apparatus has been organized. Thanks.
Right, thank you, Michelle. So just to give you an idea of the context in which this happens, you have to imagine that Colombia renders maybe dozens of judicial decisions a day related to war crimes, frequently on matters of crimes against humanity, and performs more extraditions than the rest of the world combined. So the administrative and judicial load of the protracted armed conflict inside the administration of the state the impact is very, very deep. The article that he mentioned, I thought, thank God I had read it. I thought it was phenomenal because it does, I think, what perhaps I'm thinking it as a government advisor, but the more fractal and the more granular that these discussions are, the more helpful they are for me as a legal advisor to say, listen, in this particular case, this is the limit, this is the limit. So I think they both highlight some areas in which Colombia has undoubtedly has unparalleled experience. I think first and foremost is in reparations for war crimes. I think the Colombian scheme for reparations is probably one of the most sophisticated in the world. It has, to this point, ordered reparations for over 1 million victims, and something like 9 million more in the registry. But it's been extremely sophisticated in that job. The issue of internally displaced population, I think all of us that know protracted conflicts know that that's one of the major effects on the civilian population. And Colombia has the highest number of internally displaced persons, so our efforts to deal with the effects of that have also been interesting, as well as the attempts and sort of the relationship between finding missing persons and obligations in truth and reconciliation after the end of the conflict. I think all of those things, Colombia has a very robust experience. That being said, the Colombian experience isn't useful if it is not communicated by articles like this. The decisions aren't in English, and not many would know about the practice of IHL by Colombian domestic courts. And there are parts of IHL, there are parts of NIAX and proper protracted, very technical rules that are of fundamental importance in Colombia that we have really failed to sophisticate our approach them where we really could have. Those two areas, I think, one is in the famous discussion of the alleged continuous combat function as opposed to the membership to organize armed groups. I think the problem, and Marcela does touch that in the article, and I think this is one of the areas where Colombia could be a lot more innovative in really distilling what it means to be a member of an organized armed group and what that entails for domestic law. Whether by that I mean is being a member of it something that also needs to be targeted or not? Anyways, and the relation to the conflict, the Nexus relation to the conflict, they touch on it, and I think on that we could be very innovative as well.
Thanks, Sebastian. Yes, no, I know you could go on, and I have many more questions for you, especially about, the fact that it's NIACS and how you deal with that. But I just want to give the audience a bit of a chance and fit in one question. And I think that, there's a question that's just come up about whether humanitarians organizations strategies develop sufficiently as conflicts go on. And it would be good to get your response on that, because as we're talking about protracted conflicts, it seems like a really pertinent question. So do any of the panelists want to respond to that quickly in the last minute that we have?
I can try. Michelle, yes, okay. No, it's a very good question. Very briefly, I think a lot of the reflections that are going on around protracted conflicts are precisely about questioning assumptions and ways of working. And I was just, the point I was just making before about what is the timing, but also the nature of the support that we provide to communities is something that has come into many discussions and has been put in question many times with the experience of protracted conflict. What I would say though is that the strategies of organizations evolving over time shouldn't be only about the strategy in terms of the support that they provide, the assistance that they provide to organizations. I think there is a lot to be said about strategies that look at the role of humanitarian organizations in advocating with political stakeholders for the protection of affected people. And as these protracted conflicts become more intractable and we're more and more confronted with situations that require political solution, but that are completely stuck politically, the real challenge there is how do organizations develop a strategy to bring a voice, to bring a perspective, and make the cursor change on that level without obviously necessarily getting involved into the politics of all of that. But we're often in a situation where we're on a holding pattern, waiting for a political solution that never comes. And this creates enormous ethical challenges and dilemmas for us. And so I think it's important to think of organizational strategies that are looking at operation response, but also at aspects of humanitarian diplomacy and influencing around protection issues. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Philippa. Yeah, it's always important to remember the political context and challenges that these organizations and actors face. We've unfortunately run out of time. We could continue a lot longer talking about the different issues involved. As you see, it's a very complex topic, and I urge all of you to have a look at this edition of the review and the other works of our panelists in terms of their writing and their organizations. And thank you all for joining us, and thanks again to Australia Red Cross and ICRC for putting this event together. So thanks everyone.